Hi everyone, happy Monday. I hope you guys all had a good weekend. So we left off on chapter 5 and I'm really excited for this chapter. I already took a little peek. There's a lot of pictures in this chapter too, which I'll show you all. But chapter 5 is titled First Try, and we kind of left off wondering whether they were going to successfully be able to steal Abraham Lincoln's body. So let's find out if they can. Abraham Lincoln had traveled a long and strange road to this resting place. 11 years before, in April 1865, things had finally been looking up for Lincoln. After the bloodiest 4 years in American history, the Civil War was over. Congress had passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, declaring a permanent end to slavery. On the afternoon of April 14th, Abraham and his wife Mary went for a carriage ride in Washington, D.C. And here's his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. And he spent the whole time happily greeting people on the street. "Dear husband," Mary said, "you almost startle me by your great cheerfulness." "And well may I feel so," said Abe. "I never felt so happy in my life." That night they went to see a comedy at Ford's Theater. A few minutes after 10 o'clock, John Wilkes Booth snuck into Lincoln's box and shot the president in the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness, and he died the next morning. His body was taken back to the White House and carried up to a second-floor guest room. Dr. Edward Curtis walked into the room later that morning. Small groups of generals and political leaders stood around, talking in whispers. On a table covered in white sheets lay Lincoln's body. With a room full of people looking on, Curtis and another surgeon began the autopsy. They sawed off the top of the skull and inspected the brain. The hole made by Booth's bullet was clearly visible, but the bullet itself was not. And here's a picture: Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. So if you see, he's up here. "We proceeded to remove the entire brain," Curtis later reported. "Suddenly, the bullet dropped out, through my fingers, and fell, breaking the solemn silence of the room with its clatter into an empty basin that was standing beneath." When the autopsy was finished, an undertaker named Charles Brown and his best embalmer, Henry Cattell, were shown into the room. Their job was to make the body look as good as possible, for as long as possible. They replaced the top of Lincoln's head. Brown closed Lincoln's eyes and lifted the corners of his mouth so it almost looked like he was smiling. Cattell drained the blood from Lincoln's body and pumped in embalming fluid, a mix of chemicals that preserved the body and hardened it, making the face appear more like marble than skin. The body was then dressed in one of Lincoln's best black suits and placed in a coffin. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton came in to look everything over and saw that the skin on the president's face was badly bruised from the impact of the bullet that had killed him. Here's a picture of Lincoln on his deathbed. Someone in the room asked if the undertaker should try and hide the bruising. "No," Stanton said. "This is part of the history of the event." After lying in an open coffin, or lying in state, in the Capitol building for 2 days, Lincoln's body was placed on a train for the long ride home to Illinois. The train stopped in cities along the way for massive memorial ceremonies. It's estimated that more than 1.5 million Americans filed past to see Lincoln's body. And it's Lincoln lying in state at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And then Lincoln's funeral train. Between cities, the funeral train rolled along at just 5 miles an hour, and crowds of people lined the tracks night and day, all the way west. Meanwhile, in Springfield, a battle was brewing over the body. Mary Todd Lincoln insisted her husband be laid to rest in a quiet cemetery away from the center of town. It's what he had told her he wanted. But Lincoln's friends argued he should be buried right in the city, with a grand tomb and memorial for all to see. They even bought a property and began drawing up plans. Mary got so upset that she threatened to take the body out of Springfield and bury it in Chicago instead. That won her the argument. When the funeral train pulled into Springfield on the morning of May 3rd, Lincoln's body was carried from the railroad station to the State House. Charles Brown had traveled all the way with the body, making sure it was ready for each public viewing. Now, as thousands gathered to see their fallen hero, Brown and a local undertaker named Thomas Lynch opened the coffin to make sure everything was all right. They were horrified. The bruising on Lincoln's face had grown much worse. They couldn't let him be seen this way. And here is the funeral procession in Chicago for Lincoln. I don't know if you could tell, but these are all people. Hard to see. Lynch hurried out, pushing through crowds in the hallway. I called at a neighborhood drugstore, he explained, and procured a rouge chalk and amber with such brushes as I needed, and returned to the room. Expertly applying the color of living flesh to Lincoln's face, Lynch hid the bruises. In half an hour, I finished my task, and the doors were thrown open to the public. The body was on view in the State House all day and night. The next morning, Abraham's coffin was closed, and, according to Mary's wishes, the body was taken out to Oak Ridge Cemetery. Lincoln's Springfield friends still wanted Lincoln to have a majestic tomb, so they formed a group called the Lincoln Monument Association, raised money, and built a monument at Oak Ridge. The Lincoln Monument was completed in 1874, and the president's coffin was moved inside. Lincoln's remains could finally rest in peace, or so everyone believed. When Thomas Sharp and his gang came to check out the Lincoln Monument, the first thing they saw was a tall obelisk, a needle-shaped tower of gray granite. The tower rose from the center of a square building made of the same light stone. The whole thing sat on top of a low, grassy hill surrounded by trees. In charge of the place was a bearded 57-year-old man named John Carroll Power. As official custodian of the Lincoln Monument, Power earned $50 a month to take care of the monument and lead tours of the tomb. And here's a picture of the Lincoln Monument being built. He personally greeted every visitor, including each of the Logan County gang members. They seemed to him like typical tourists. All visited the monument and mingled with other visitors, he would later write. Power showed guests into the structure, explaining that the main entrance opened into an oval chamber called Memorial Hall. The custodian had turned this into a homemade Lincoln museum, setting up glass cases and filling them with various Lincoln-related items from his personal collection. There were letters from Lincoln, photos, a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, even surveying tools Lincoln had used as a young man. But the prize of the collection was a bloody strip of fabric. Moments after Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater, an actress named Laura Keene ran from the stage to Lincoln's box and cradled the head of the dying president. Years later, Powers paid $25 for a piece of Keene's blood-stained dress and put it on display in Memorial Hall. And here's John Carroll Power. An interesting little show, but the Logan County boys saw no sign of a coffin. Several of them asked Power where Lincoln's body was. It was a question Power got all the time, and not one that aroused suspicion. He explained that on the other side of the building, about 150 feet from Memorial Hall, was a second, smaller room, the tomb chamber, or catacomb, as Power called it. Power led his guests outside and around the monument to the catacomb. 2 locked doors guarded the small room. The first was wood, with a glass window. It was a joke the gang saw. You could simply kick it in or break the glass. The second inner door was a gate of thick steel bars secured with a padlock. That would be more of an obstacle, but hardly discouraging. Through the doors, guests could dimly see the far wall of the catacomb, where there were 5 closet-sized crypts. The body of Lincoln's dead sons rested in 3 of the crypts. The empty ones were for Lincoln's one living son, Robert, and his wife, Mary. In the middle of the floor sat a large marble sarcophagus, or casket. Inside the sarcophagus was a coffin made of red cedar. Inside of that was an airtight coffin of thick lead. Inside of that was Lincoln's body. Each gang member had a look and heard some version of Power's presentation. To be sure he'd understood, one of them asked Power if the body was really right there, above ground. Yes, said Power. The room had a tile floor, and the marble sarcophagus rested on the tiles. Another gang member asked if he could take a look inside, just out of curiosity. Sorry, Power apologized. No visitors allowed in the catacomb. How about a night guard? Surely someone stayed in there at night to keep watch. No, said Power. There was no night watchman, either at the tomb or the surrounding cemetery. And here's a diagram of the Lincoln Monument. So here is where his body is, in the catacombs. The gang members met back at their saloon in Springfield. It all looked good, they agreed, even easier than expected. There would be no digging required, which simplified things. They just needed to break through a couple of locks, crack open the stone sarcophagus, and yank out the cedar coffin. It'd be heavy with the lead box inside, but doable with 5 men. They'd load it into a wagon, drive to the river, and bury it in the spot chosen by Kenneally, a gravel bar under a bridge a few miles out of town. Then, while the nation celebrated Independence Day, they'd scatter and disappear. By early June, the gang had all the details worked out, all the tools ready. The only thing left to do was wait for the big night. That turned out to be the hardest part. Until that time, all had gone along smoothly. John Carroll Power later wrote, each and all had kept their secrets, and not a shadow of suspicion had been aroused. But now, with 3 weeks to kill, the men started hanging around in bars, drinking heavily, and trying to impress the women of Springfield. One night, Thomas Sharp got drunk and started crowing about a big deal he had in the works. So here's another map of the Lincoln Monument grounds. Doesn't really say much. While everyone else was shooting off fireworks, he bragged, I'm going to be out at Oak Ridge stealing old Lincoln's bones. A woman named Belle Bruce turned to Sharp in shock. Was he really serious? Sharp assured her he was. Later that night, Bruce repeated Sharp's strange tale to Abner Wilkinson, Springfield's chief of police. Wilkinson ran into John Carroll Power on the street the next morning. He told me confidently, recalled Power, that in the discharge of his official duties, he had discovered a plot to steal the remains of President Lincoln. Meanwhile, Belle Bruce must have told a few other folks Sharp's wild story, because within a day it was all over town. The rumors quickly got back to Sharp himself. Sober now, Sharp must have cursed his stupidity. It was safe to assume the police already knew about his plans. He'd blown the job. The Logan County gang lugged everything movable out of the saloon, loaded it into a wagon, and raced out of town. All they left behind was an unpaid rent bill. Whiskey alone is entitled to the credit of having thwarted this well-laid scheme to steal the remains of President Lincoln, recalled John Carroll Power. But the maddening thing was that the custodian couldn't get anyone to pay attention to the close call. The whole city seemed focused on preparing for the country's 100th birthday. And then, just 2 days after Independence Day, shocking news arrived by telegram from the West. Horrible, screamed the headline of the Chicago Tribune on July 6, 1876. General Custer attacks an Indian camp with 5 companies, and all perish. 10 days before, on the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana, U.S. soldiers, led by George Armstrong Custer, had clashed with Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. I can't talk today. The Indian fighters quickly surrounded Custer and more than 200 of his men and wiped out the entire American force. In the ongoing wars along the western frontier, this was by far the worst defeat ever suffered by the U.S. Army. As Americans began to recover from the shock of Little Bighorn, the country's interest turned to the next big news story, the presidential election set for November. The Republicans nominated Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats picked Samuel J. Tilden, governor of New York. This was shaping up to be the most hotly contested election since the Civil War, and by late summer, the nasty campaign was well underway. With so much going on, no one was too concerned with the bizarre rumors floating around Springfield, Illinois. No one but John Carroll Power, that is. He went directly to his bosses, the leaders of the Lincoln Monument Association, and told them what he knew about the plot to steal Lincoln. It seemed to them so incredible, he recalled, that no attention was given to it. Basically, Lincoln's old friends didn't believe the story. So here are the presidential candidates, Rutherford B. Hayes, and here's Samuel Tilden. They told Power to forget the whole thing, and the fact is, Power's job was a big enough headache without the worry of body snatchers. The Lincoln Monument had been built so badly that pieces were already falling off, and on rainy days, drops trickled through the stone roof onto the visitors' heads. That's assuming they could make it up the muddy paths to the tomb. So Power got back to work, and everything drifted back to normal in Springfield. Big Jim Kennelly watched it all from a safe distance of St. Louis. Sure, he was stewing with fury at the Logan County gang for their bonehead blunder. The idiots had blown a golden opportunity. But the good news was, no one seemed to have noticed. Big Jim was convinced his idea could still work. Kennelly sold his St. Louis stable, packed up his bags, and bought a train ticket for Chicago. He was part owner of a saloon there. That's where he could find the men he wanted to see. Kennelly didn't believe he needed a better plan. He just needed a better team. The end. Well, that took a turn. So I guess they didn't steal his body that time. Maybe next time. See you later.